Good afternoon, and first I want to say thank you to Fingal County Council for the invitation to give this talk and explore something that is fascinating, the events of the Truce period in Fingal. This is a high-level and brief overview of the events in North County Dublin between the 11th of July 1921 and the outbreak of the Civil War in June 1922. By the time the Truce came into effect on 11th of July 1921, Ireland had been convulsed in violence and societal disruption for 5 years. The Easter Rising in April 1916 was followed by mass arrests, court-martial, deportations and internment. The 5th Fingal Brigade of the Irish Volunteers, formally established by P.H. Pearse in June 1915, was not only represented in the fight in the city centre, sending 20 men into the city garrisons, including Edward Lawless, Richard Coleman and Thomas Peppard. Fingal was also the scene of one of the rare outright victories during Easter week, when the volunteers defeated a column of RIC in what has become known as the Battle of Ashburn. Fingal was well represented in the rising's aftermath, with 114 individuals being arrested. Amongst the names from North County Dublin were Thomas Ashe, Richard Coleman, Frank Edward and Joseph Lawless, Thomas Peppard, Richard Mulcahy, Richard McKee and Charlie Weston, all names that would play a role in the revolution when it came around a few years later. By 1917, most of these men had been released again and were back in Ireland, picking up the threads of their revolutionary activity as if they had never been away. Events ramped up throughout 1918, including the arrest of Frank Lawless in the so-called German plot arrests in May 1918, and the traumatic death of Richard Coleman in Usk prison from influenza in December. The year 1918 culminated in the general election, in which Sinn Féin destroyed the long-standing ascendancy of the Irish Parliamentary Party, reducing it to a mere 6 seats. In North Dublin, Frank Lawless, who was still in prison, was elected for Sinn Féin, defeating the incumbent J.J. Clancy by 4,700 votes. Lawless was also still in prison when the first Dáil met in January 1919, the same day as the Solo Headbeg ambush in Tipperary, which is generally taken to be the first shots of the War of Independence. The War of Fingal may not have been as intensive as it was in other parts of the country, and Lusk volunteer Thomas Peppard noted in his witness statement that the countryside was unsuitable to guerrilla warfare. But North County Dublin saw some of the most notable incidents of the conflict. In March 1919, an IRA raid on the British military post at Collinstown Airdrome netted 70-plus rifles and thousands of rounds of ammunition, which would supply the IRA across Dublin for most of the rest of the war. In February 1920, the county was declared to be, quote, in disturbance by the police, joining Louth, Longford, Sligo, Westmeath and Wicklow. In September 1920, Head Constable Peter Burke was shot dead in an altercation in Balbriggan, and shortly afterwards, auxiliaries from Gormanstown camp raided the town, burning 50 buildings and brutally killing 2 men, James Lawless and John Gibbons. The sack of Balbriggan, as it became known, created worldwide headlines, and the town was visited by the American Committee for Relief in Ireland, thus ensuring that British rule in Ireland came under intense international scrutiny, and provided many parallels with German actions during the First World War, with the Manchester Guardian referring to the event in Balbriggan as Ireland's Louvain, referring to the German destruction of the Belgian city in 1914. The attack on Balbriggan became one of the most notorious events of the War of Independence, along with the burning of Cork in December. More houses were burned in Swords in November, while Thomas Hand, secretary of the local branch of the ITWU, was shot dead at his home in Skerries. What all this means is that when the truce was announced in July 1921, it most likely came as a relief to the inhabitants of North County Dublin. One of the narratives of the truce is that the IRA ramped up its violence in the last few days before the fighting ended, either out of a sense of vindictiveness or a wish to demonstrate some last-minute martial spirit. Writer Richard Bennett complained about the, quote, 11th hour warriors of the IRA, killing 5 British soldiers across the country on the day of the 11th, while Pierce Beasley has grumbled about the, quote, belated exhibitions of prowess with no military prowess. This interpretation, although much repeated by historians through the years, has come under scrutiny recently, and for our purposes it is enough to point out that it did not represent the pattern in Fingal. For instance, the planned ambush on the RIC in Yellow Firs, rumoured to carry cash for payroll, was cancelled on the 9th of July, the day after IRA Chief of Staff Richard Mulcahy transmitted the news that the truce had been agreed. Having said that, though, The existing and surviving documentation shows that the Fingal IRA were ordered to take action in the days before the truce. Seamus Finn, adjutant of the 1st Eastern Division, issued very direct instructions on the 9th of July, ordering the IRA in the East to, quote, hit everywhere and anywhere you can within your area before 12 noon on Monday. All spies of whom you may already have been advised of are to be executed before the said hour on Monday, end quote. Despite this seemingly cold-blooded order, no civilians or any police were killed either in Fingal or indeed the whole of the 1st Eastern Division between the 9th and the 11th of July 1921. But the cessation of hostilities did not mean an end to IRA activity in Fingal, but it did require a certain amount of readjustment on the part of those involved. Volunteers reported that they struggled to adapt to the liberty that they now enjoyed. James Crenigan, who was adjutant of the Fingal Brigade, stated that, quote, it was strange to go home again and sleep there in peace. It was likewise strange to walk on the street or road and pass the towns and RIC without getting stuck up or putting one's hand to one's gun. Likewise, Joe Lawless, Frank Lawless's son, said after the war that he found the atmosphere in Dublin very unsettling. Quote, the mental habit of years cannot adapt themselves to new orientation overnight, and it took me some days to accustom myself to going around with the feeling of assured safety while publicly acknowledging my identification with the national revolutionary movement. Crenigan took advantage of the truce to pay off some of the bills to local farmers that the volunteers had run up during the conflict. And the IRA also took the opportunity to stage public parades and reinforce their presence in the public consciousness. For instance, they would regularly march to Mass, as they did in Swords in November 1921. In the same month, there was a very large volunteer presence at the commemoration of the death of Lieutenant John Sherlock at Skerries, the 1st Battalion Fingal Brigade. Local civic organisations also began to turn to the Republican movement for assistance, now that they were no longer under suppression. For instance, in December 1921, the Irish Product League Balbriggan branch asked the local IRA to support them by smoking only Irish tobacco and using cigarettes made in Ireland. Evidence from Fingal witnesses in the Bureau of Military History also shows that there was a feeling amongst the IRA there that the truce was simply a pause in the war. As Joe Lawless, who was then interned at the time, recalled, quote, the general feeling we had at the time was that the truce was most probably a temporary respite, and that, when negotiations broke down, the war would begin again with redoubled effort on both sides. In our discussions, we could not visualise the British government consenting to any measure of freedom that would satisfy our national aspirations. While on the other hand, we knew we could not and would not abate our demand for the recognition of Dáil Éireann as the only lawful government of our native land. Freed from surveillance and the threat of arrest, IRA intelligence work continued at pace. Instructions sent to the battalion and intelligence officers from General Headquarters instructed them to collect details on post offices, gentry houses and railway stations, to infiltrate enemy social locations and to compile lists of, quote, all persons whom you might reasonably suspect to be in touch with and liable to give information to or help the enemy. Ex-policemen, ex-soldiers and persons of this class are used extensively by enemy intelligence system and therefore they need special watching. Remember always to report everything, the instructions concluded. Report it accurately, report it carefully, promptly and precisely. These were instructions that the Fingal IRA took to heart, reporting copiously on post offices and railway stations across the county, complete with details of management and postmasters, and those officials whom they considered to be particularly pro-British. Malahide Golf Course was singled out as the sole enemy social institution, and the IRA even managed to obtain the names and addresses of visitors to the course. They also kept a close eye on locals that came to their attention. For instance, in October 1921, it was reported that a bread van driver from Rush had become close friends with a man from Donnybrook who was thought to be an Irish volunteer. The volunteer was advised against discussing official business with his new friend, and the gentleman from Rush, who was described officially in IRA documents as a big mouth and a talker, was kept under close observation, as well as having his post opened. He was eventually determined to be harmless and unlikely to engage in underhand work. But watching the local population was a regular part of IRA intelligence work, and as Thomas Peppard, who eventually became Fingal's intelligence officer, recalled in his witness statement, he asked his intelligence staff to, quote, keep a close watch on all residents in their area with an eye to finding out those who might be aiding or abetting the enemy force. Fingal Brigade IRA also worked hard to infiltrate post offices and reported that they had people passing them information from inside Finglas, Garristown and Duleek post offices. The station masters of Laytown, Balbriggan, Skerries, Rush and Lusk, Donabate and Malahide railway stations were identified as being particularly pro-British. In addition, the truce afforded the IRA the chance to examine its own ranks. In February 1922, intelligence from Fingal reported an overheard conversation between two black and tans to the effect that they had survived an unspecified ambush in the west of Ireland due to information received from an informer they had inside the IRA. And this report was forwarded to the 3rd Western Division, although the result or any follow-up is unknown. In addition, the military camp at Gormanstown, just over the county border in Meath, was kept under very close observation. In August 1920, the Veterans and Drivers Division, which provided all transport for the auxiliaries, was sent to the camp, which was built in the site of a British airdrome. In October 1920, it was converted into an extended training camp for black and tan recruits. Gormanstown was the base for the auxiliaries who raided Balbriggan in September 1920, and so it was of particular interest to the IRA in the area. Several unsuccessful attempts were made to intercept the post coming into and out of the camp, so that the names and address of the officers could be obtained. And the one time that the IRA did seize the post, it did not reveal any usable information. In January 1922, Peppard reported that he had received assistance from a certain Constable Pipe, who was stationed at the camp and who had a fondness for alcohol. Pipe had been transferred to Galway, and Peppard was informing HQ that he could be of help again in the future. As Peppard described him, he is essentially an Englishman. He is very fond of drink, but will act straight, provided he is similarly dealt with. In the same month, Peppard also reported that he had received intelligence that the RIC were planning to burn Gormanstown when they vacated it. This step is necessary, Peppard wrote, in view of the stock taking which will reveal huge defalcations running into thousands of pounds that must be blotted out prior to demobilisation. Valuable buildings, the future property of the Irish Free State, will be destroyed if the proposed burning is allowed to be carried out. Peppard was correct that the British were planning to evacuate the camp, but he was wrong that it was to be destroyed. Evacuation of troops and police began in January 1922 before being formally completed in August. The camp was handed over and officially dedicated as an Irish Army facility in October of the same year. At the same time, the truce offered the chance for Republicans to solidify their claims to be the legitimate government of the country. During the War of Independence, the RIC withdrew from its most exposed barracks, which were generally then burned by the IRA. The ensuing vacuum was filled by Republican police, who undertook investigations into petty crime, robbery, and lesser local offences. Punishments were often swift and sometimes unusual, consisting individuals of being paraded through the locality, banished from their district, or even being given a physical beating. For example, on the 14th of October 1921, volunteer police cleared the pubs at closing time in Skerries, evicted lodgers from rented properties in Athlone, and while in January 1922, 3 men who were arrested for robbing the Galway branch of the Munster and Leinster Bank were given 6 hours to leave the city, with the threat of being forcibly removed if they failed to comply within the time frame. While the Republican police were becoming more prominent, Minister for Home Affairs Austin Stack established a parallel court system which operated in competition with Dublin Castle's legal system, and these Republican courts were regularly raided from July 1920 onwards. Once the truce came and the hostilities ceased, Stack seized the opportunity to centralise and streamline the court's operation from August 1921. It was under this new dispensation that Frank Lawless presided over a Republican court at Carnegie Hall in Swords on the 8th of October 1921, although we have no records of what was discussed there or what outcomes resulted. One of the major issues facing the IRA during the truce was how to maintain their effective strength once the war ceased. The strength of the Fingal Brigade IRA on the 11th of July 1921 was recorded as 594 officers and men across 4 separate battalions. This made up almost 16% of the total of the 1st Eastern Division of 3,745. By the 1st of July 1922, Fingal had dropped to 140 officers and men across 2 battalions, a decline of over 76%. The total strength of the 1st Eastern Division dropped by 46% from 3,745 on the day of the truce to 2,119 on the 1st of July 1922, and during this time Fingal declined to making up just 7% of the divisional total. Fingal was also one of the formations that suffered the most, along with the 2nd Meath Battalion, which lost 74% of its members in the same 12 months. The pattern was repeated across the country, with areas that supported the treaty tending to see a fall in IRA membership, while some Ulster counties saw an increase as the implications of partition became apparent. Across Leinster, the trend was downwards, and Wexford was the only Leinster county that witnessed an increase in IRA membership during the truce. As we have seen, in the First Eastern Division, Fingal was the area in which the membership dropped off most sharply. Some explanations for this steep decline suggest themselves. The need for men and women whose lives have been disrupted by conflict, arrest and imprisonment to restore some normality by finding employment or setting up homes, or the natural wastage experienced by all organisations as members move, leave or are promoted. Joe Lawless noted that after the war, the IRA attempted to take advantage of the truce by setting up training courses across the country. Quote, "In order that the time could be usefully employed in training the men in tactics and the proper use of weapons, and more important still, to instill some sense of discipline. The difficulty here, however, was that competent instructors were scarce, and the political hysteria at the time prevented whole-scale application by students or staff." Lawless's first point about instilling discipline at a time of little or no action to motivate IRA members was important. General HQ was compelled to issue a general order in November 1921, instructing that any volunteer officer found drinking, frequenting public houses for the purposes of drinking, or continuing indulgence in drink, having previously been warned by their OC, was to be reduced in rank. Those who were found to have offended again subsequently were dismissed from the IRA entirely. Incidents of drunkenness involving the volunteers in Fingal during the truce appear to have been relatively rare, at least according to the surviving documents. One recorded instance was in February 1922 in Donabate, when 4 IRA members were refused entry to a pub at 1 a.m, after which they fired shots in the air, although no injuries were reported. They returned again at 7 a.m. and again tried to get into the pub, and after being refused admittance, again fired their weapons in the air. The political hysteria referred to by Lawless was the increasingly bitter debates that were occurring over what would result from the protracted negotiations between the British government and the Irish representatives. The signature of the treaty in December 1921 would eventually lead to the split in the Republican movement and the outbreak of civil war. Frank Lawless, TD for Dublin County, voted in favour of the treaty during the heated debates in the Dáil in January and on the 9th of February 1922. The treaty was ratified by the Dáil. Lawless's son recalled in his witness statement that he listened to the anti-treaty arguments, but that he was, quote, "not convinced of the logic of their case." Lawless expressed some strong opinions on the split, suggesting that, quote, "loud talk and wordy argument took place of reasoned thought in most cases, and the alignment of the IRA and the treaty versus anti-treaty issue was decided largely in arbitrary fashion by incidental factors which had little to do with the issues at stake." End quote. The IRA fractured on the issue of the treaty, with the areas most heavily engaged during the War of Independence tending to oppose the agreement. Thus, most of Munster and Connacht were solidly anti-treaty, and the pro-treaty support came mostly from Dublin, the Midlands, Clare and Limerick. Of the 16 IRA divisions that existed in early 1922, only 7 remained loyal to General HQ and therefore adhered to the treaty settlement. First Eastern Division was solidly pro-treaty, meaning that Fingal was spared the damage witnessed in other parts of the country. As is well known, Dublin City Centre was the focus of intensive and highly destructive fighting in late June and early July 1922, and the first shots of the Civil War were the artillery fire on the four courts. Following their defeat in Dublin, the IRA reverted to guerrilla tactics, allowing the initiative to pass to the National Army, which slowly but surely ground down Republican resistance throughout the country, and the war finally came to an end in April 1923. There had been little chance to organise anti-treaty resistance in Fingal, and in any case, the pro-treaty stance of Frank Lawless and his sons would have gone a long way towards securing the area for the provisional government, given that decisions over which side to support in the Civil War were sometimes made on personality alone. Thomas Peppard's observation of Fingal being largely unsuited to guerrilla warfare during the War of Independence meant that it was also of little use to the IRA during the Civil War, and once the city of Dublin fell, the focus of the conflict turned elsewhere. In any case, Fingal was part of a large swath of pro-treaty territory, with its neighbouring IRA divisions, the 5th Northern and the 1st Midland, also opting in favour of the treaty. Fingal during the truce was a microcosm of the rest of the country. The ending of hostilities was undoubtedly welcomed by the population, who were weary of the constant turmoil from 1916 onwards. But it must not be forgotten either that Ireland had actually been at war since 1914 as part of the UK and suffered at least 30,000 deaths during the Great War. This, added to the upheaval caused by the revolution, likely meant that the truce was seen as a long overdue return to some sort of semblance of normality. Men and women who had been deeply involved or had their lives disrupted by conflict found it difficult to readjust to peace again. In common with the rest of the country, the voices of Fingal women and how they found the transition brought about by the truce are relatively rare, and the history of the revolutionary period is incomplete without them. At the same time, the pattern of Republican activity across Ireland during the truce was replicated in Fingal. The volunteers took the opportunity to reinforce their hold on the public consciousness by public parades and commemorative activities. The IRA continued to collect intelligence, largely on the assumption that the war would soon be resumed, and demonstrations of independence such as Republican courts were held. The sharp drop-off in IRA membership between July 1921 and July 1922 reflected the county's orientation towards the pro-treaty side of the Republican split, and Fingal was spared the widespread destruction that the Civil War brought to the rest of the country. The truce, for the most part, presaged a return to normality for Fingal. Thank you very much.